"Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the counter while we verify this." The branch manager's voice carried across the lobby, pitched just loud enough that the 6 people in line turned to look. Terrence Boyd stood at the counter with his 8-year-old daughter beside him, a folder of paperwork in one hand and her small hand in the other, trying to open a college savings account he had been planning for 3 years. He wore a plain gray work jacket, jeans, boots that had seen a decade of use, and he had just handed over $11,000 in cash, money he had saved in an envelope at home, rather than trust to an account he didn't yet have. And the moment the teller saw the amount, everything about the interaction changed. Within 4 minutes, 2 security guards were standing near the entrance. A manager was on the phone with someone described only as compliance. And Terrence's daughter, Imani, was standing very still beside her father, watching adults treat him like a criminal for the crime of trying to save money for her future. What happened over the next 30 minutes would end with the bank's own head of security going pale at the sight of a coin in Terrence's hand, an apology delivered in front of the entire lobby, and a room full of strangers learning exactly who they had accused of fraud. If stories like this keep you watching, subscribe, because there is more coming. Terrence Boyd had spent 14 years learning to live quietly, and he had gotten good at it. He worked as a warehouse operations lead for a logistics company, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 when a shipment schedule demanded it. And he had raised Imani alone since her mother died of an aneurysm 4 years earlier, a loss that had arrived with no warning and left him rebuilding an entire life around a routine that could hold a grieving 8-year-old, steady. He was 41, solidly built, with the kind of stillness that came from a man who had learned long ago that most problems were better solved by staying calm than by matching anyone's volume. He did not talk about the years before the warehouse job, the 11 he had spent in the Army, the last 6 of those attached to a military police unit that had done work he still did not discuss with people who had not been there. He carried one visible reminder of it, a coin he kept in his jacket pocket every single day, worn smooth at the edges from over a decade of handling, given to him by a commanding officer after an incident he rarely allowed himself to think about in detail. Imani knew her father had been a soldier once, the way children know facts about their parents without absorbing the full weight of them, and she knew he kept a coin in his pocket that he let her hold sometimes on quiet evenings. And she knew he never raised his voice. Not once. Not even the day the transmission went out on the highway, with both of them inside the car. Their apartment sat on the 2nd floor of a modest complex on the east side of the city. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen table with exactly 3 chairs, because Terrence had never seen a reason to buy a 4th, and a hallway lined with Imani's drawings, updated every few weeks as new favorites replaced old ones. He kept a single frame photograph of her mother on the bookshelf, not out of unresolved grief, but because he had decided early on that pretending she had never existed would only teach Imani that love could be erased without consequence. And he refused to raise his daughter on that lesson. He worked hard, more hours than strictly required most weeks, because over time, paid for things like new shoes, before she outgrew the old ones, and the occasional weekend trip to the state park she loved, and because staying busy kept certain memories from his years in uniform at a manageable distance. He rarely spoke about them, not out of shame, but because he had learned that most people who asked were looking for a story to be impressed by, not an honest account of what it had actually cost him, and he preferred to keep that particular ledger private. The savings account had been 3 years in the making, an idea Terrence had started the week after Imani's mother passed, when he sat at the kitchen table one night and decided that whatever else the world took from his daughter, her future was not going to be one of them. He worked overtime when it was offered, skipped things he wanted for himself more often than he told anyone, and kept the money in a fireproof envelope in the closet, because the bank near their apartment had closed a branch 2 years earlier, and the nearest replacement was a 20-minute drive he rarely had time for on weekdays. Today was a Saturday. Imani was out of school, and Terrence had finally set aside the morning to open the account properly at First Meridian Trust downtown, the bank he had researched online because it advertised education savings plans with better rates than anywhere else in the city. He had dressed the way he dressed most days, work jacket, jeans, boots, because he did not own much else and had never seen the need to pretend otherwise for an errand that had nothing to do with anyone's opinion of him. Imani wore her favorite yellow dress and had insisted on bringing a small backpack containing, among other things, a stuffed rabbit and a folder of her own, where she planned to keep, in her words, the papers that proved the money was hers. They arrived at 11 in the morning. The lobby moderately busy. Marble floors and high windows, giving the space the particular hush of institutions built to feel more permanent than the people passing through them. Terrence took a number, waited 15 minutes with Imani quietly reading a book beside him, and was eventually called to a teller window staffed by a young woman named Kayla, who greeted them both with a professional, unremarkable politeness. Terrence explained what he wanted, a custodial education savings account for his daughter, and produced the folder of paperwork he had prepared in advance: birth certificate, social security documentation, his own identification, everything organized in the careful, methodical way of a man who did not like leaving loose ends for other people to trip over. Then he set the envelope on the counter and told Kayla the deposit was $11,400 in cash. Kayla's expression shifted the moment the number left his mouth, a subtle recalibration that Terrence recognized immediately because he had seen it enough times over the years to know exactly what it meant. She counted the money twice, which was standard procedure, and Terrence understood that. But something in the careful, deliberate way she counted it a third time suggested procedure had stopped being the only thing driving her attention. "I'm going to need to get my manager," she said, sliding the cash into a drawer rather than handing it back or proceeding with the deposit. Terrence asked whether there was a problem with the transaction. Kayla said it was standard for larger cash deposits and asked him to wait. He had heard variations of that sentence before, in other rooms, from other people, and understood already that the word standard was carrying more weight than it should have. The manager, a man in his 50s named Dale Whitfield, arrived within a few minutes, reviewed the paperwork without acknowledging Terrence directly, and asked, in a tone that made clear he had already reached a conclusion before asking the question where the cash had come from. Terrence said it was savings, accumulated over 3 years, kept at home because the family had not had convenient access to a branch. Dale asked why someone would keep that much cash outside a bank for 3 years instead of depositing it as it came in. Terrence explained, evenly, that the nearest branch had closed and the replacement was inconvenient given his work schedule, and that he had intended to open this account as soon as the amount felt substantial enough to justify the trip. Dale looked at him for a long moment, the particular look of a man deciding whether an explanation was worth believing, and said he would need to place a temporary hold on the transaction while the bank completed additional verification, standard under federal reporting requirements for large cash transactions. Terrence knew enough about banking regulations to know that a currency transaction report was a routine federal filing, not a reason to detain a customer or interrogate him about the source of his own savings. And he said as much, calmly. "I understand you're required to file a report for a deposit this size," he said. "That's not the same as needing my life story before you'll process it." Dale's expression tightened slightly, the look of a man unaccustomed to being corrected by someone he had already decided did not merit the correction. "I'm just doing my job, sir," he said. "If you have nothing to hide, this shouldn't take long." Imani, standing beside her father with her backpack straps gripped in both small hands, looked up at him with an expression that was starting to shift from curiosity into something closer to worry. "Daddy," she said quietly, "why is he being like that?" Terrence put a hand lightly on her shoulder, kept his voice steady for her benefit. "We're just waiting on some paperwork, baby," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Dale disappeared into a back office for several minutes, and when he returned, He was accompanied by two men in the bank's private security uniforms, who positioned themselves a short distance from the counter, with the particular stillness of men trying to look unobtrusive, while very obviously not being unobtrusive at all. A woman at the next window over, who had been quietly conducting her own business, glanced toward the growing group with visible concern. An older man waiting in line behind Terrence set down the newspaper he had been reading and watched openly, his expression darkening as the situation continued to develop in front of him. "I've contacted our compliance department," Dale said, returning to the counter. "Given the amount and the circumstances, we need additional documentation before this deposit can be accepted. Can you tell me your current employer and produce recent pay stubs showing income consistent with this amount of savings?" Terrence felt something tighten in his chest. Not panic, but the particular frustration of watching a routine transaction being treated as an interrogation, because a bank manager had looked at his jacket and his boots and decided, in under a minute, exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. "I don't carry pay stubs to a Saturday errand," Terrence said. "Still level, still controlled. I can provide my employer's information, and you're welcome to verify anything you need through proper channels. But I'd like you to explain to me why a routine cash deposit requires two security guards standing behind you while we have this conversation." Dale did not answer that directly. "Standard precaution," he said, "for transactions of this nature." Terrence looked at him for a long moment. "This nature," he repeated. "Say what you mean." Dale's jaw tightened, and for the first time, something less composed than procedure crept into his voice. "Sir, large unexplained cash deposits are frequently associated with certain kinds of activity," he said. "I'm sure you understand why that requires additional scrutiny." He did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. The word certain had done all the necessary work, and everyone within earshot understood exactly what it implied. The older man in line behind them set his newspaper down entirely and spoke up before Terrence could respond. "That man showed you a folder full of documents and told you exactly where the money came from," he said, addressing Dale directly. "What exactly is unexplained about it?" Dale glanced at him with visible irritation. "This doesn't concern you, sir," he said. The man did not back down. "I've been banking here for 15 years, he said. "I've made cash deposits larger than that without anyone calling security. I'd like to understand what's actually different this time." His question hung in the air, unanswered, because the honest answer was not one Dale seemed willing to say out loud in a lobby full of witnesses. Kayla, still standing near her register, had gone very still, her eyes fixed somewhere on the counter, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the encounter had taken, but equally clearly unwilling to say so to her manager directly. Imani tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she said, her voice small, "are they going to take our money?" Terrence crouched down to her level, kept his voice warm and even, the voice he used specifically to keep the world's unfairness from becoming her burden to carry. "No, baby," he said. "This is our money, and nobody here has any right to take it. Sometimes people make bad decisions about who to trust, and this is one of those times. But it doesn't change what's true." Imani nodded, mostly reassured, though her eyes kept drifting toward the two security guards with the wary attention of a child cataloging a threat she did not yet have full words for. Dale, apparently sensing that the mood of the lobby had begun tilting away from him, doubled down rather than reconsidering. "I'm going to need you to step away from the counter while we sort this out properly," he said, his voice carrying the particular firmness of a man trying to reassert control he could feel slipping. "This won't take long if you cooperate." Terrence did not move. "I am cooperating," he said. "I gave you documentation. I gave you an explanation. What I haven't given you is a reason to treat me like a suspect in my own bank, in front of my daughter, and I'd like you to explain that gap before we go any further." The lobby had gone noticeably quieter around them, the ambient hum of a Saturday morning branch replaced by the particular attentiveness of people who sensed something worth watching, unfolding a few feet away. It was at this point that a man walked in through the branch's side entrance. A police officer named Sergeant Ray Okafor, there for an unrelated matter involving a fraud case the bank had flagged earlier in the week, and the moment he stepped into the lobby, the tension was visible enough that he redirected toward it out of professional habit, before anyone asked him to. He was in his late 40s, solidly built, with the watchful calm of a man who had spent 2 decades reading rooms for a living. He took in the scene, the security guards, the manager, Terrence standing his ground with his daughter beside him, and something in his gaze sharpened as it landed on Terrence's hand, where he had unconsciously begun turning the worn coin over between his fingers, an old habit that surfaced whenever he needed to keep himself steady. Okafor's eyes fixed on the coin, then moved to Terrence's face, and something shifted in his expression that had not been there a few seconds earlier. "Where did you get that coin?" Okafor asked, his voice quieter than anything else spoken in the lobby that morning. Terrence looked at him, uncertain, and held it up slightly so the sergeant could see it clearly. An eagle stamped into worn brass, a unit designation around the edge that had faded but not disappeared. "3rd Military Police," he said, "given to me by my company commander after an incident overseas, back in '09. Okafor's expression changed completely. "I know that unit," he said, his voice unsteady now in a way that made the entire lobby go quiet around him. "I was attached to a joint task force that same year, working alongside your people on a convoy security operation outside Kandahar. There was an ambush on a supply route, a vehicle disabled, gunfire from 2 directions, and one soldier held the position alone for almost 11 minutes, got 3 wounded men into cover, and kept radio contact with air support until reinforcements arrived. I never met him. I only knew what came through in the after-action briefing. Everyone called him the guy with the coin, because his commander made a point of telling the story every time somebody asked about unit pride." Terrence stood very still, the coin suddenly feeling heavier in his palm than it had in years. "That was me," he said quietly. "Staff Sergeant Terrence Boyd. Left the service 6 years later. Hearing damage in my right ear from an IED the following spring. Decided it was time to come home and raise my daughter instead." Okafor crossed the remaining distance between them and extended his hand, and when Terrence took it, the sergeant held the grip a moment longer than a simple handshake required. "I've told that story to younger officers more times than I can count," Okafor said, his voice rough. "Never had a name to put with it. 3 of those men went home to their families because you didn't move from that position. I need you to understand what that means to people who know what that day actually cost." The older man who had questioned Dale earlier stood up from his seat near the waiting area and approached the counter, his expression carrying the particular weight of someone who felt compelled to say something before the moment passed. "I've been coming to this branch for 15 years, he said, addressing no one in particular. "I've never once seen a manager treat a fully documented deposit like a crime scene. I hope somebody higher up hears about this, not because of what this gentleman turned out to have done years ago, but because of what almost happened to him today, regardless of it." 2 other customers nodded in visible agreement, and a woman near the door, who had been recording quietly on her phone since the security guards first arrived, lowered it slightly, apparently satisfied that the situation had resolved itself without needing to escalate further. Kayla, still standing near her register, exhaled for what looked like the first time in several minutes. The lobby had gone completely silent. Kayla's hand had come up to cover her mouth. Dale, for the first time since Terrence had walked through the door, had nothing to say. The older man who had questioned Dale earlier was watching with an expression of quiet, focused respect, and several other customers had stopped what they were doing entirely, sensing correctly that they were witnessing something that mattered more than the transaction that had started it. Imani looked up at her father, then at the sergeant, piecing together fragments of a story she had never been told in this much detail, her small hand tightening around his fingers. Okafor turned to Dale, and his voice, when he addressed the manager, carried an authority that made clear exactly whose judgment mattered in that lobby now. "What exactly is the issue with this gentleman's deposit?" he asked. Dale, visibly rattled, mentioned something about standard verification for large cash transactions. Okafor asked whether the customer had provided documentation. Dale confirmed that he had. Okafor asked whether anything about that documentation had actually raised a legitimate concern, as opposed to simply the size of the amount and the appearance of the person presenting it. Dale did not have a good answer, because there wasn't one. Only the accumulated weight of a decision that had started the moment Kayla looked at a man in a work jacket, sliding an envelope of cash across the counter, and assumed the worst before asking a single honest question. "I'd like this transaction processed immediately," Okafor said. "And I'd like an explanation from your branch about why a customer with complete documentation was treated like a suspect in front of his own child." Dale, moving with considerably more urgency than he had shown at any earlier point in the encounter, returned to the counter and personally supervised the completion of the deposit, his hands noticeably less steady than they had been 20 minutes earlier. The federal reporting form was completed as a routine matter, exactly as it should have been from the beginning, without a single additional question about where the money had come from or why Terrence had chosen to keep it at home. Kayla, once the transaction was complete, looked at Terrence with an expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and genuine regret. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have just processed it." Terrence looked at her steadily. "You should have," he agreed. "Not because of anything you just heard about me. Because that's what should have happened the moment I put documentation on your counter. What you're feeling right now, the way this suddenly feels different, that's the part I need you to sit with. Not what changed in the last 5 minutes. What you were willing to do before any of that." Dale attempted stiffly to offer something resembling an apology. "I hope you understand we have obligations," he said, and Terrence cut him off, not with anger, but with the flat clarity of a man who had spent his whole life being handed explanations dressed up as regulations. "You had an obligation to treat a documented transaction like a documented transaction," he said. "You chose to treat it like a crime because of what I looked like walking in the door. That's not a regulation. That's a decision you made, and it would have been the wrong decision no matter who happened to be standing behind me a few minutes later." Dale had no answer for that, because there wasn't a good one. Okafor crouched down slightly to speak to Imani, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide, careful eyes. "Your dad's a hero. You know that," he said gently. She nodded slowly, filing the words away with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I knew he was brave," she said. "I didn't know it was like that." Okafor smiled at her. "Bravest thing about him isn't what happened over there," he said. "It's that he came home and built a whole quiet life around taking care of you, and never once needed anybody to know the rest of it. That takes its own kind of courage." Imani considered this, nodded again, and reached up to take her father's hand. On the drive home, Imani was quiet for a while, working through something in the unhurried way she worked through most things. "Daddy," she said eventually, "why didn't you tell them who you were right away? It would have stopped faster." Terrence glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Maybe," he said. "But then the lesson everybody in that room would have learned was that I deserved to be treated fairly because of what I did years ago. Not because it was already true before anybody knew a single thing about me. I want you to understand the difference between those two lessons, because only one of them is actually true." Imani considered this for a long moment. "So it's not about being a hero," she said slowly. "It's about just being treated right, because you're a person." Terrence nodded. "That's exactly it," he said. Imani nodded back, satisfied, and then, because she was 8 years old and the morning had run its course, asked if they could get pancakes to celebrate her new savings account. Terrence laughed, the sound loosening something in his chest that had been tight since the moment Dale first looked at his boots and decided what kind of man owned them. He thought about that morning often in the weeks that followed, not with anger, which had never been the feeling he carried longest, but with a plain, clear-eyed understanding of what had happened and what it meant. The bank's regional office called him the following week, an apology delivered by someone considerably more senior than Dale, along with confirmation that staff at that branch would be receiving retraining on cash transaction procedures and unconscious bias, delivered without him needing to ask for either. Terrence accepted the apology without making more of it than it was. What mattered more to him was quieter than any formal gesture. The fact that his daughter had watched her father hold his ground calmly in a room that had decided to doubt him, had watched people slowly recognize a truth that should never have needed recognizing in the first place, and had learned, without being told directly, that dignity was not something you earned by revealing what you had done. It was something you were owed simply for showing up as yourself, documentation in hand, asking for nothing more than what was already yours. Some mornings, the measure of a man is not the medal he was given or the story behind it, but the quiet, steady life he chooses to build once nobody is asking him to prove anything at all. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming.